Hello. You have just begun a presentation on the AASL Learner Standards for School Libraries. This presentation is intended to be a basic introduction. Later throughout the PD plans for Knox County Schools, you'll be able to dive in a little bit deeper and find out more about how these are implemented in your libraries and your programs. For today, however, we're going to spend about 2 hours getting to know some of the terminology and some of the practices that we believe are going to help you get these under your belt. So in order to do that, you are going to need some digital files. Those files have been provided for you at this link. Instructions for manipulating those files are here and also on the next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to pause this presentation if you need to in order to read through the info on this slide so that you can get those files ready for your learning. I'm also in just a second going to forward over to the next slide so that when you are ready you can move on to step 2 of getting those prepared. Again, feel free to pause the presentation on that slide so that you can read those directions carefully and get them all set up. So whenever you have both parts completed, essentially you're taking a group of Google files and folders and importing them into your drive and making copies that you can manipulate. As soon as you are finished with that, you can go ahead and continue on to the next part of the presentation. Hi. I'm Amber Mosier, and I'm going to be spending about 2 hours with you today to help you get a very basic grasp on the AASL learner standards and how they'll be applied here in the Knox County schools. If at any time during this presentation you need to stop on a slide and maybe mull it over a little bit more, feel free to hit the pause button, and then when you're ready to keep going, just hit play and the presentation will continue right along. So this past school year, the 17-18 school year, myself and these individuals here on the curriculum team spent a lot of time getting to know what your needs were as a department, what our students' needs are as individuals who are growing up in the 21st century, and what the standards provide for us. We spent lots of hours together each month trying to wrestle these down into an understanding that we thought could be shared out to others in a pretty straightforward way. And we also talked a lot about what our future is going to look like, because as with any group of standards, this won't be just a one-shot thing. We are going to continue layering on additional knowledge and understandings that are going to come as a byproduct of just working with these standards, and then of course attending various workshops and things where we can grow in our knowledge of that. But I wanted to take just a moment and offer up a big thank you to these 10 folks that you see here on our screen. They, again, lent countless hours and brilliant comments and workable ideas, and for that, we are super thankful to them. If you see them somewhere at a workshop or a meeting, be sure to give them a pat on the back. Okay, so standards, standards, standards. You've already heard me say that word several times today. There are lots of standards that influence us as librarians. As you know, we have ISTE, We have 10 core, the content area standards that many of you collaborate around and coordinate with in your programs. And we also have future ready program standards. All of those are valuable in providing you with some direction for your program and providing you with some fresh ideas and ways to lean into the future with your program. But when we are thinking about instruction, and that instruction can occur with students or teacher adults, when we're thinking about instruction, we want to make sure that we are pulling from the National School Library Standards for Learners issued from AASL. And the reason we are kind of hitching our cart to that so heavily is because those standards have come from years and years of professional research and revision, and we feel that they are the very best of what's out there that can help us design programs that will assist students in becoming college and career ready. So, if your principal were to say to you, so what are your standards? Instructionally, they will be the AASL standards. Now, speaking of principles and standards, you're going to see in just a couple of slides that we are going to be working on a 3-year arc for embracing these standards here in Knox County. This is year 1, and year 1 is a heavy-duty learning year. You will be implementing some, you will be learning a lot. And so I have entered some information on the Library Media Services School Wires page that administrators can get to pretty easily, and it explains what our learning curve is going to look like. So if your principal wonders why you are folding in these standards in the way that you are, that text on the School Wires page will hopefully provide them with the justification that they need. So let's take a minute and let's look at those standards. You're going to see on some of the slides in this presentation that there will be a little icon and a number somewhere on the slide. That indicates that in your Google folder that you guys pulled over there in that first slide when we got started a few minutes ago, there is a corresponding item in that folder that pulls up this information for you. So for example, if you pull up file number 2, you're going to find this vocabulary. Also, if you have one of the large standards placemats that we've distributed, you'll find this vocabulary on the back. I want you to take just a couple of minutes, and I want you to read over the front part of the standards where all the competencies are listed. You don't have to read them for full understanding, but just kind of glance over them and get a hazy idea of what's in there. And then turn over to the back and look at the vocabulary. These are all terms that I'm sure you are familiar with. However, you may be seeing them in a different context within our standards discussion. So just kind of read over them and see where we're heading with these terms. You may want to pause this video for just a moment while you take care of those two things. And when you're ready to resume, you can go ahead and hit play. On the previous slide, you saw a graphic. Let's go back and look at it for a second. At the bottom of the page that demonstrates the relationships between standards, objectives, and curriculum. You won't find that on your placemat, and that's simply because we were running out of room, but that was brought into the presentation because just from observation, it became evident that lots of folks are using those 3 terms interchangeably, and they actually refer to 3 different things. A standard is, an eventual learning outcome for students. The objective is the small step that you're taking towards that standard in any given lesson. And your curriculum is how you arrange those standards and objectives to complete a robust program. So, as we're talking about standards, curriculum, and objectives, make sure that you are queuing up in your mind the precise definition for each of those. I think that'll make the conversation a little less cloudy. Now, speaking of curriculum, let's see what AASL has to say about these standards and a curriculum.
Like other sets of national educational standards, the AASL standards are not a curriculum. Rather, they provide guidance and structure as you develop a curriculum tailored to your priorities and needs. This approach enables school librarians to personalize their professional practice and growth, continuously tailoring their school library to community needs, their own strengths, and learners' benefit. Through the AASL Standards web portal, school librarians can find professional development tools and resources to help inform your stakeholder communities. Visit standards.aasl.org to access resources to support your implementation of the standards locally and to connect virtually with a vibrant community of professionals across the country. The American Association of School Librarians empowers leaders to transform teaching and learning. No matter your position within the education community, AASL's new integrated standards are designed to do just that.
Okay, so as the speaker on the video said, the standards do not make a curriculum. A curriculum is a document or a series of practices that you would create and adopt to get you planned and ready to make sure each student has an opportunity to master the standards. As in years past, we will not be creating a district-wide curriculum. And you know from previous conversations, it's because of the wide variety of programs that we have out there. Some flexible schedules, some fixed schedules. Some are in a position where they see students very frequently. Some don't see students quite as frequently. Some have students for 45 minutes. Some have students for an hour and a half. And so it's impossible to deliver a document that paces out what should happen and when it should happen. So instead of that, you, the individual practitioner, are being empowered to create a curriculum that's responsive to your student needs and your program design. So the good news is, hooray, you get to decide what goes on in your program. But the bad news is, you have to decide what goes on in your program. I wish we had a better solution, but we simply, through some trial and error of ideas, we simply cannot think of a product that would be useful for everyone and do the kinds of things that perhaps a pacing guide or a scope and sequence might do for a classroom teacher. But again, hooray, you get to decide how this is going to play out in your program. But with that decision comes, with that autonomy comes a great responsibility towards our professional body of knowledge. Take a look at this statement for just a moment and think about what that means to you. Some ideas that might prod you along with your thinking are, what if you were to hear a phrase like this? My kids could never do that. These students aren't ready to perform at the level of these standards. I know what my students need. Just because something's in these standards doesn't mean I need to teach it. If we're operating within the parameters of our professional body of knowledge, then these statements that I just made become less and less of an issue because our professional body of knowledge, the AASL standards, and some of their research behind it tells us that students can and should do these things. And if it is more difficult for a particular group of students, then it's up to us to structure encounters with these opportunities that will lead students toward mastery of a standard. It's up to us to structure those opportunities so that they are accessible to kids in varying age groups, demographics, and points in their program. You know, a student at the beginning of English in 7th grade is quite different from a student at the end of the English course in 7th grade. So it's up to us to factor all of those things in when we are creating our programs and our lessons. We don't have the capability, at least not ethically, to say, oh, well, we simply can't do that here. Instead, we have the autonomy to make those decisions that will bring those experiences to meet your students where they are. Okay, so if we're going to put ourselves into a position where we are ready to deliver all these school-specific curricula based on the standards, we have a lot of work to do. As you can see here, we're going to be taking this learning arc on a 3-year stint. I think it would be very overwhelming to try to enact all the things that we believe are going to be necessary for a successful implementation during year 1. That would be really overwhelming. So as you can see here, we have things broken out into 3 years. If there are some terms on here that you're not familiar with, that's okay. Those probably come from some of the research that we've done about kind of change management and how to plan things for long-term success. What you really want to focus on is what's here in the turquoise box. So these are the things that we have committed to for year 1. Therefore, everything we do today is going to be directly tied to those actions. So I'm going to give you just a moment to look over these 2 columns and see how today's actions are going to help us lean into what we've committed to for year 1, and then we're going to dive in and get started. If you need to pause to read a little bit more, feel free. Otherwise, we're going to move on. Okay, first thing, let's talk about these common beliefs. They are on the back of your placemat. They're also in your Google folder. The common beliefs contain the kinds of language that we saw embedded in the former iteration of the standards, and they allude to those foundational things that are probably at the core of what made each of you want to become a school librarian. Things like the school library being a unique place in the school, reading having such a core and integral part of a learner's life, intellectual freedom. All these things are foundational to school librarianship. A couple of folks, actually plenty of folks, I think, have read through the competencies on the front side of the standards document and have gotten a little alarmed that this type of language is not embedded within the standards. That doesn't mean that these things are no longer important. In fact, it's quite the opposite. These common beliefs were pulled out separate from the competencies in the standards to show that they are the foundation of any library program. It is a given, it's understood that these things are happening within your program and they undergird every other thing that you do in your library program. So the common beliefs aren't just kind of tacked on to the standards, they are the foundation of the standards. So you might want to pause and take a moment to read over these. If you look on your placemat with the competencies on the front and common beliefs on the back, you'll see a fuller description of what each of these common beliefs refers to. We're going to go ahead and move past those common beliefs and into the front side of the standards document. We're going to look at the competencies now, and we're going to discuss for a bit how they're being used in different arenas. As we talked before, some folks have fixed schedules, some folks have flexible schedules. We are all over the board in how we serve our students. So there are a couple of different ways we can use this standards document to help us make sure that we are exposing as many students as possible to as many standards as possible. One method is treating the standards document as a personalized guide, and I'll let you read this for just a second. And now we're going to see how one of our high school librarians, Suzanne Sherman at Hardin Valley Academy, has used the standards in just such this way.
Hi, I just want to share with you some of my experience of working on the curriculum team and trying to implement the new AASL standards, particularly when it comes to the planning that I do with teachers at the high school level, and really looking at how this curriculum can fit with theirs, taking these just different competencies and looking at how these can help us build student engagement and have the students thinking critically. So my method has been to, first of all, laminate these standards so that they are in front of me at all times. You can see my little Post-its on here. This is where I have been collaborating with teachers in different subjects and just kind of looking at where I can fit in with them in their planning and really teach these lessons with them that just call for students to think a little bit more critically perhaps than maybe my old methods of planning would have. And so I've sort of challenged myself to take this, and I'm treating it kind of like a bingo board where I'd like to cover everything by the end of the year. Doubt that's really possible, but I'm going to aim for it. And what this has helped me do is to really just focus on areas that perhaps I might not have before. Instead of just taking a lesson that a teacher has and just trying to see where it fits with my curriculum, I've instead sort of looked at my curriculum and tried to see how it can fit in with their lessons. And it really has helped me in several of my lessons just to think a little bit more deeply about how I can get the students involved in that learning process. That's what I love about these new standards most of all, is that they are so student-centered, and they really provide almost a little bit of a roadmap for thinking about activities that you can incorporate where students are doing the learning themselves and we're not just handing them that information. So I just, really am focusing on trying to fit these in where I can and really just look at what I can do that will have the most impact within their lessons.
Okay, so that is one method that you could use depending on how you interact with your students and teachers. Another method is coming up from Rebecca Bennett. And Rebecca Bennett is an elementary librarian, and so she sees her students more predictably on a regular basis. And she talks about using the standards as a progression. So before we hear her, take a moment to read this for just a moment. And now let's hear Rebecca.
The new standards to me seem much more like a continuum, and they promote a mindset of continual learning throughout school and life. So we're talking about life skills here. If you look at the domains going down the page, right down here, we have think, create, share, and grow. And this is more like the process we go through as lifelong learners when we learn something new. But if we go across the top here, the share foundations inquire, include, collaborate, curate, explore, and engage. To me, these feel much more like higher level thinking skills that help us be ready for college and careers and the workplace.
So as you can see, two different approaches, both of them completely valid. You'll need to give some thought to what might be best in your program, or maybe something completely different, or maybe a mix of those two. So we have talked a lot about what our plans are, what these standards are designed to do for our students. We've talked a lot about things on a kind of a broad philosophical level, and we're now going to get into actually applying the standards to our instruction. All right, I want you to take a look at this slide. Take a look at the little house here, and imagine someone asked you to excavate this home. What would you do to the home? What changes would take place? Think about that for just a moment. You might be thinking things along the lines of, well, if I had to excavate it, I would probably be digging up the foundation. I might demolish the whole thing. I might have to, scrap it and start over. In any of those instances, you probably wouldn't have this same house sitting in this same place as you did before. Now, what if you were asked to elevate this same house? Think for a moment about what you would do then. If you had to elevate this house, what would you do and how would it change? You may be thinking things such as, oh, if I had to elevate it, I might add something to the top, maybe another story. I might add something to the bottom, maybe a basement. If I'm thinking of elevating it in an aesthetic way, maybe I might paint it, maybe I might add in some landscaping. But if I were to elevate this house, a lot of the features of the house would remain the same, but something additional would be added to it. So I want you to take these two analogies, and I want you to keep in mind that we are asking you to elevate the current lessons that you have. You may not need to excavate them entirely. The reasoning behind that is your existing plans were based on the previous set of AASL standards. They were already in great shape. These new standards, of course, are a little different, and we are asking you to apply additional competencies on top of them. So in many instances, you are going to be able to take an existing lesson plan and add a new competency to it. Some of them, you may not be able to do that, and you may want to rethink that lesson's usefulness in your program. Craig Castile, one of our elementary librarians, is going to talk a little bit about his thinking when it comes to deciding whether or not to keep a lesson plan or excavate it and start with something new.
How do the new standards affect lessons we've already created? The new standards are not specific as to what we should or should not teach. We need to use professional judgment in terms of what we keep or what we decide to replace. Our last curriculum did a great job in changing the mindset of following a skills checklist. The new standards give us more autonomy in creating lessons and adapting our own curriculum. So, what do we do with those old lessons? Ask yourself these questions. What are the needs of my students, teachers, administrators, parents, and community? Why am I still teaching these lessons? If you can't justify keeping lessons, let them go. If you decide that old lessons are still useful, keep them. Just apply the new standards to elevate them.
Okay, so what I've done is I have here in the background, let me show you a couple things that I have ready that'll be handy for you. In my participant folder copies, I've gone down to Padlets and I have opened up some Padlets. If you want to follow along and type into those Padlets, you're welcome to do so, or you can hang out and watch me. I've opened those Padlets up here, and we're going to be visiting these and adding some things to them as part of our lesson elevating process. So I'm going to go back here and let's get into this assignment. So we're going to apply one competency from the front of that standards placemat to this lesson. This is elevating. We're going to add small tweaks to the lesson to bring it up to the spirit of the new competency. So listen to me as I think through this. Consider the basic flow of this common project, and if you've not ever dealt with this specific project, I'm sure you can imagine something similar at your own school. So a teacher is assigning an 8th grade colony report, and it typically goes a little something like this. Students are assigned a U.S. colony, and they could be doing this solo or in pairs. They are given specific facts that they're supposed to locate, such as, who was the governor or the leader of the colony, what was the population, when was it founded, what company may have sponsored it, typical kinds of things. Then they're supposed to record those findings somehow. Maybe they are permitted to create a brochure with those findings, or maybe they are supposed to get up and present their findings some way in front of the class. Okay? If I were to elevate this lesson, if I were to add something to it to make it reflect one of the new standards, then I'm going to have to consult my standards document. So you'll want to get out either a digital copy or a print copy of your standards document as well. And what I'm doing, although I know you can't see me, is I am just running my eyeballs all over this document until I see something that jumps out at me as a possible candidate for adding to this lesson. I have already entered in, right up here in the upper left, my idea for elevating this colony brochure lesson. So my idea was to take 5D2, and that's over in the Explore Shared Foundation, and that particular competency reads like this: learners develop through experience and reflection by recognizing capabilities and skills that can be developed, improved, and expanded. I've noticed perhaps that my 8th graders aren't really good at this. When they turn something in, they feel like they're finished with it, and they don't ever go back and revise or iterate and try to apply any kind of feedback or better ideas to their learning. So what I'm going to have them do is, when they're finished with this project, in whatever format the teacher has asked them to complete it in, I'm going to have them go back and I'm going to have them reflect on what went well with the presentation and what could be improved. Then I'm going to have them develop a plan to address the improvements for the next presentation assignment. It's not enough, I've noticed, with these kids to just have them identify what needs to be fixed. They need to come up with some strategies for addressing those things that they know that they maybe struggle with or aren't completely competent with just yet. They need to come up with a plan for addressing those in their future work. So I didn't change the teacher's assignment. I just added something to it to make it rise to the spirit of the new standards. So what I'd like for you guys to do over the next few minutes is get back into those Padlets, and I'd like for you to look at the ones that are in the grade band that you teach in, and I'd like for you to add some potential elevations to the lesson idea that's printed at the top of the Padlet. So you're going to see on the Padlet lots and lots and lots of ideas that have already been added. This is, what you're seeing there is a compilation of all of the ideas that were generated in the summer standards training sessions. So you're going to see some really good ideas already sitting there. What you come up with may be similar to an idea that's already there, or it could be entirely new. Either way is perfectly acceptable. I just want you to practice using the standards document to apply some new elements to these lessons so that they'll rise to the spirit of the new standards. So once you've completed a couple of those exercises, you can resume the video and we'll keep going. Okay, now that you've had a little bit of practice with elevating some lessons, I want you to take a moment to reflect. And again, pause this video here for a minute or so that you have time to think through the 3 questions that are on the screen, and then you can resume. So what you did a moment ago on the Padlets was ideate and brainstorm so that you could attach a new idea to a familiar lesson. So that's the start for elevating lessons, but as I'm sure you're beginning to realize in your mind, actually designing and teaching the lesson would go a little bit further than that. So what we're going to do next is talk about how an elevation would actually play out in a lesson. Where would it fit in the instructional delivery, and what would I be looking for as an instructor? So in your participant folder, you have a file 5, that's called exemplars. And what these are some lesson plans that our curriculum team shared so that we could take a look at how they would approach elevating these lessons. We'll be looking at different ones throughout this training session, but we're going to start with the 2nd grade lesson that in the past had been a lesson about Pebble Go. So I'm going to give you a second to navigate over there, and I'm going to get there myself. So here we are in the exemplars. All of the exemplars are in this one file. They're positioned just one after the other. So we're going to start here at the top. This was a lesson submitted by Jessica Carter, Karn's primary librarian, and in the past, this is how she had taught the lesson. It had addressed these former AASL standards, and I'll give you a second to read over those. And it looked like this. So she's folded Pebble Go into a unit that was about reference materials. She had already taught them about reference materials. This lesson would focus specifically on online databases, particularly Pebble Go for 2nd grade. These students would be taught how to use Pebble Go. I imagine that would be probably navigation and things like that. And then they would get on a computer and select an animal on Pebble Go, and then take notes on a template provided by the librarian. On their next visit, students would outline a paragraph based on the notes that they took, and then after outlining, the students would write a paragraph and draw a picture of their animals. So this very much appears to be in line with these former standards. Review and listen for information in order to make inferences and gather meaning. They're definitely gathering meaning through reading about their animals. And demonstrate mastery of technology tools for accessing information and pursuing inquiry. So they were definitely having to master basic computer skills and navigation of Pebble Go. They were also doing a few other things, namely, looked like they were focusing on some writing, but definitely we were in the right ballpark with these former standards. If she were to elevate this lesson, she decided that she would add in 4B4, which is over in the Curate Shared Foundation. And this one says, as you can see, learners gather information appropriate to the task by organizing information by priority, topic, or other systematic scheme. So that's a little bit different from the language of these former standards. Therefore, the lesson, if it's following this idea, should play out a little differently too. Let's look at what the new lesson would look like. So students would still learn about reference materials, and they would still find out about Pebble Go. Maybe, hey, this is this database that we have. Here's what it looks like. Here's how you navigate. It said students normally fill in the blank with different information with Pebble Go on that template that she provided. But now she would do this part differently. And I noticed this is different from reading the previous iteration. She would have students come up with 3 to 5 questions that they are curious about for an animal. And after students complete finding and writing their notes from Pebble Go, students would compare their notes to another database such as Kids Info Bits or WorldBook Kids, and then students would have the option to type their findings in a Google Doc or Google Slide, and students would present to their peers what they found out. Let's go back and look back at the standard here. Learners gather information. They're definitely doing that here. Organizing information by priority, topic, or other systematic scheme. So it looks to me like this lesson could actually go a couple of different ways. It's kind of hard to tell what Jessica had envisioned entirely for this lesson simply from this blurb here. But since she's having students write questions and then find the answers, she could be focusing on organizing information by like a question and answer format, kind of like a KWL chart. She could also go a different route, with comparing their notes to another database. She could have them organize their findings maybe in a Venn diagram that lists what was presented in Kids Info Bits versus what was presented in Pebble Go and what was the same. So there are a couple of different ways that this lesson could serve to bring in this standard. Now, we think about why would we need to do that? Why would we need to provide students an opportunity to gather information and organize it by priority, topic, or other systematic scheme? In the future, when they are working on organizing thoughts and ideas for writing projects, when they are faced with having to share information with others, it's of course always easier to read and digest if it's organized according to a particular scheme. So by doing this, we're providing students with the opportunity to build some skill with presentations that they are going to have to participate in the future, whether it's a written presentation, a visual presentation, maybe even an oral presentation. We're giving kids experience towards that goal. So what I'd like for you to do now is get back into these exemplars. Again, there are lots of different grade levels presented in this one long document. find a couple that are pertinent to your grade band, and I want you to look at the column on the left where the librarian has summarized how they used to do the lesson, and then look closely at the column on the right to see how the lesson has changed. See if you can trace some shifts in their thinking from the old lesson and standard to the new lesson and standard. And I'd like for you to pause the video now and resume after you have worked through a couple of those. What I'd like for you to do is, once you've selected a lesson, I'd like for you to read through the old part. So let's take a look at a few of those. I'm going to pull up, this one's first, so I'm going to pull it up. What I'd like for you to do is read through what the lesson used to look like on the left, and then I want you to come up with some ideas for how you could elevate this same lesson and record your ideas here on the right. In order to do that, you're going to have to read closely over here to get the gist of the lesson. Then you're going to have to read over the standards document and find a competency that's a natural fit for this lesson. And then you're going to sketch out in your mind, or you can type it on your own copy there in your folder, kind of create a sketch for what this lesson would look like now. I'd like for you to pause the video, and I want you to spend as much time as you need going through at least one, ideally 2 of these, to give you some adequate practice. Okay, now that you've had a little bit of practice with elevating a lesson, I'd like for you to practice elevating one of your own lessons. In file 7 in your participant folder, you'll find a blank template. It's exactly like the one you've seen in the previous examples. What I'd like for you to think about is either a lesson that you have coming up, or if you kind of draw a blank on that, try your OPAC lesson. Most everybody has an OPAC lesson. That would be a great place to start if you can't think of anything you've got coming up on the horizon. So what you're going to do is you're going to write on the left, this is how I typically taught this lesson. These are the standards it used to cover. Then over on the right, you're going to apply a new competency to it. Again, you're going to have to look through your standards document and find a competency that's going to be a natural fit and is going to enhance this lesson for your students. So you can pause the video and resume once you've got an elevated lesson that you're satisfied with. Okay, so we've had a couple of different practice opportunities where we have used the standards framework to pull in these college and career competencies so that we can offer students these great experiences. You might have felt a little tension as you were thinking around these different examples, and then in your own lesson, you know, what exactly is this elevated lesson aiming for? Sure, I can put an idea on top of an old lesson, but what am I really trying to do? An effective way to think about that is to think about objectives. Remember back at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the difference between standards, objectives, and a curriculum. This is how it's all coming together now. What we've been looking at so far as we've scanned over the framework is we've been looking at the broad standards. And we've taken those broad standards and we've laid them on top of some of our former lessons, and we've come up with an executable idea. We've said to ourselves, oh, okay, well, I could do this. What we need to add to that to make it as sharp and as definite as possible is a clear objective, so that we're taking this broad standard, We're coming up with some activities, some materials, maybe some thinking and problem solving opportunities, definitely some higher order questioning. We're going to put all those together in the pursuit of a clear objective. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's just take a look over here at the right side. I'm going to show you a lesson plan that I drafted, and we're going to see if we can find some flaws in it. Okay, so the former lesson was a 6th grade lesson on the ethical use of others' works. I bet lots of folks have a similar lesson where you talk about plagiarism and citations and that sort of thing. That lesson in my head could be elevated by applying 6C1, and that's over in the Engaged Shared Foundation. So it reads, learners responsibly, ethically, and legally share new information with a global community by sharing information resources in accordance with modification, reuse, and remix policies. So here's how it plays out. I've got a 6th grade ELA teacher, and she wants to give her students an exercise in this ELA standard. Describe how the plot of a story or drama unfolds, as well as how the characters respond or change as the plot moves toward a resolution. That's not my standard, that's hers. That's what her lesson is designed around. So the teacher's idea is she wants to accomplish this by having students create a soundtrack for a text. So she's going to have them take a chunk of the text, and she's going to have them build a soundtrack that reflects, the tone, the mood, and that sort of thing. So my idea to contribute to this lesson is that the librarian will provide students with the rationale for citing each song, and then the librarian would provide students with the tools for generating those citations. Now, let's go back up here. And let's look at our standard again. Let's see if I've addressed it. Responsibly, ethically, and legally share new information with a global community by sharing resources in accordance with modification, reuse, and remix. We're definitely addressing reuse here, and I am giving them the tools to share responsibly, ethically, and legally, so I think I'm in line with the standard. Now, let's take a look at the objective. On this template, you're going to see that there are 2 types of objectives listed. There's a primary objective and there's a secondary objective. Let's talk a little bit about what that terminology means. A lot of the lessons you're going to teach are only going to have one objective, and of course that's going to be the primary objective. And that objective should be designed to point directly back to the standard. It says write an objective that is appropriate for the age and background knowledge of your students, and again, it's towards the mastery of the standard. A secondary objective might be something that you're hoping students will master, or at least start building towards mastery, maybe in a topic or an idea. So for instance, let's say that I'm doing a lesson on, I'm teaching the Dewey Decimal System, but what I'm really driving towards is the standard where students are sharing products with an authentic audience. Maybe I'm going to have students create word clouds that reflect what goes into a specific Dewey category, and then they're going to share those word clouds with some of the younger students in the school. Creating that learning product would be my primary objective. My secondary one would be a good grasp of what goes into Dewey categories. A lot of times you're not going to have that secondary content, but if you do, that's what I'm referring to here in this template. So back to this soundtrack lesson. Let's take a look at 3 objectives that I've generated, and we're going to figure out which one is appropriate and which one is not appropriate. So if my goal is for students to have experience here, and the reason I keep saying experience and not mastery is because we're not going to get mastery with one exposure. This is something that we're going to build and build and build and build. Okay, here's one. The learner will, or you could phrase it, I can, create a playlist with 10 songs. Next, we have the learner will, or I can, select songs appropriate for each major story event, or the learner will, or I can, correctly attribute authorship to songs included in a playlist. Let's talk about these. This first one is not an appropriate objective for my section of this lesson. This might be an appropriate objective for the classroom teacher. If that's what she's looking for in this assignment, this would be perhaps an objective that she could incorporate, but this is not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the playlist. Remember, I'm looking for the responsible, ethical, and legal attribution in the form of a citation. Let's look at the next one. Select songs appropriate for each major story event. Again, that's not what I'm driving towards. It is part of the assignment, but it's a part of the assignment that the classroom teacher is going to provide for them. This is not what I'm driving for. I'm not driving for songs that are a good fit for a particular piece of the story. I'm, again, headed towards providing that ethical reuse. Let's look at the third one. The learner will, or I can, correctly attribute authorship to songs included in a playlist. This is what I'm trying to accomplish in this lesson. So this would be my primary objective. In fact, the way I have this imagined in my head, this is the only objective that I'm going to be driving towards in this lesson. So our objectives are going to take us from this broad standard, okay, learners responsibly, ethically, and legally share new information with a global community by sharing information resources in accordance with modification, reuse, and remix policies. And we narrow it down into the specific thing we're going to be accomplishing in this lesson. There's a lot of information here. I could probably get a lot of value out of having one lesson that focuses on responsibility, another lesson that focuses on the ethics, yet another lesson that talks about what's legal and what's illegal when it comes to reproducing others' work. Then I could get down into, well, what's it mean to modify something? What's it mean to reuse? What's it mean to remix? And how do I determine what needs to be attributed to someone and what's fair use? I could get into a lot of things here, but what I've chosen to attack in this lesson is just the correct attribution of authorship to these specific songs. And of course, in the lesson, I am going to talk about the why. Why do we need to do that? But I'm going to also really stress, this is going to be my main intention here, is to get them to create those citations and include them in their work. So back to the ideas we were looking at, we just took a broad standard. We said, hey, here's how I could attack this standard, and here's exactly how I'm going to do it. The example we just looked at helped us kind of tease out how the objective can be used to clearly define what, or how rather, these 3 things here are going to be aligned. Okay, we've already talked a bit about the difference in a primary and a secondary objective. I just want to throw in at this point that I'm not concerned that you guys have a clear working definition of what a primary objective is versus a secondary objective. Those are just some vocabulary terms that help explain things a little more clearly. What I do want you to keep in mind, though, is that when you are creating an objective for these elevated lessons, it should come from the standard. That means, because the standards don't have those library flavored competencies in them anymore. You don't see the Dewey, the OPAC, you don't see genre and things like that. You won't have any primary objectives that cause students to master those ideas. Instead, students will be working towards the competencies that are on the framework, which I'm sure you've noticed by now are largely effective learner behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean that our library flavored content is no longer important. It's just going to take a back seat and become secondary objectives. Another example to reiterate that would be, for instance, if you were teaching fiction genres, instead of your lesson focusing on whether or not students could either define different fiction genres or perhaps identify the genre of a given book, that might become a secondary objective as you pursue something else from the framework. For instance, you might pull in 5C1, for example, that says learners engage with the learning community by expressing curiosity about a topic of personal interest or curricular relevance. Excuse me. You might have students brainstorm the kinds of genres that they have experienced in the past, and then you might have them generate questions regarding specific fiction genres. For example, what makes something science fiction? What are the elements of a fantasy book? And so on and so forth. And then since that standard is pointing out engaging with the learning community, maybe you devise some activities where students are kind of operating in a jigsaw manner, where each person takes one of those questions and then finds the answers and comes back and teaches the other members of their group about that. In that scenario, your main focus would be the students being able to go out, find the information, and come back and effectively share it with others, while your secondary focus would be, hey, what did you learn about those fiction genres? So let's see some objectives in action. I've gone back to File 5 in your participant folder, and I'm just going to pull up those exemplars again. We're going to look at two in particular. I'm going to scroll down, and I am going to find a lesson written by Suzanne Sherman. This is a high school lesson. It'll be coming up here in just a second. There it is. And this was an 11th grade lesson. It was for junior English. It was a CP class. They were doing a research project, and she was working with them in this encounter specifically on finding their sources. So we're gonna skip the "this is how it used to look" section. We're going to go straight to "this is how it looks now," so we can see the connection to the objective. So she says, my primary goal in elevating the lesson is to increase engagement and self-direction on the part of the students. This involves working closely with a teacher who's willing to allow the assignment to be more student-directed and who will be flexible with students in making some choices, even if it means revisiting their original topic. So there, Suzanne's giving some of her rationale for choosing this particular elevation. And what she's chosen to add in is this. She's got something from Inquire, which is Shared Foundation 1. Think is Domain A, and competency number 1 is this one. So if you read it all together, it says, learners display curiosity and initiative by formulating questions about a personal interest or a curricular topic. How she's going to accomplish that is this. classroom teacher and Suzanne will help guide students into thinking about researchable interests that they have. These can be any topics that have a personal meaning to them. After they've brainstormed on their own, let's see, the whole class, or as a whole class, students will help one another narrow those topics down. They'll list their own prior knowledge about the topic, and then with the group, they will solicit more information to help build upon that background knowledge. Okay, so what she's doing, she's actually kind of changed what her original lesson was all about. Initially, you could see that she was focused on finding sources. Now she's focused on finding an appropriate topic, which, as we all know, is the number one key to research success. So her objective when she's working with students to try to accomplish this stuff right here, her objective reads, students will be able to formulate questions regarding an area of personal interest to research and find answers to. So this is what she's going to focus on, is students questioning and figuring out, what is it that I really want to dig into? Notice her objective is not about anything classroom related. It's not about the teacher's content area. Rather, it's about the standards she pulled off of the framework. Let's go on down and find an elementary lesson. This one is written by Rachel Thompson. It's a lesson for first and second graders. And the idea behind the lesson is book recommendations or book talks. And here's what she has decided to do to this idea to elevate it. She's going to incorporate 3B1, which is in collaborate, in the create domain, and competency 1. So that says learners participate in personal, social, and intellectual networks by using a variety of communication tools and resources. So what that's going to look like in Rachel's library is this. Students will create book talk videos using Flipgrid. They will record themselves giving a short book talk, trying to convince someone to read their selected book without giving away the ending. As an extension, students could also write a short tweet describing why they like the book and send that tweet to the author. Sounds fun. So her objective is students will use a variety of communication tools. I might even define that a little further. I might say students will use Flipgrid as a communication tool, or if I were working on this extension, I might say students will utilize Twitter as a communication tool, just so that I know exactly what I want students to get out of this. Students know exactly what they're going to be doing to accomplish this, and anyone else who might be observing or involved in the lesson would have a clear idea of what's going to happen as well. Okay, I'm going to go back to the presentation now, and we're going to get some practice in putting this whole process together. We're going to elevate a lesson, and we're going to set an objective for the lesson. And after we've done those two things, we should have a clear idea of where we're headed, and that will allow us to build appropriate activities, materials, problem solving and thinking opportunities, specific questions. It'll help us build all of those necessary ingredients to get this content across to students. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take this lesson starter. There's a 7th grade honors social studies teacher at your school who wants to collaborate with you to change up her annual big project. She typically has students research an ancient emperor and students put on a wax museum. If you're not familiar with the wax museum, this is a format lots of teachers use. A student will assume the role of a historical figure, and often they'll dress up, bring some props, that sort of thing. Then they assemble themselves in a room somewhere, and audience people come by and they activate a pretend button on the wax museum figure, and then the student comes to life and tells all about the historical figure and what their significance was, and so on and so forth. So what you're going to do is you're going to help this teacher jazz it up a bit. You're going to add in some of these new AASL standards that are going to lean a little bit closer to college and career readiness. So I'm going to do a little example for you, and then I'm going to turn you loose to try one on your own. So what I was thinking of, the standard that I would choose is this. I would incorporate 1C4, and according to the framework, that is in Inquire, and it says learners adapt, communicate, and exchange learning products with others in a cycle that includes sharing products with an authentic audience. So the reason I chose that was, I've noticed in my own practices that if students know that there's going to be someone other than the teacher looking at their work, that generally ups the quality of whatever it is they're creating. So I'm going to leverage that so that students feel compelled to do their very best work. And I'm also going to use the sharing facet as a vehicle for helping out some other students who are not in this honors class. Let's look. My idea is that the honors students could create and share their works cited of the resources they use in researching their emperor. So, for example, if I have Genghis Khan, I am going to do the research necessary to find out all the facts that I'm supposed to find out. And then I'm going to create that works cited page that says, hey, here are all the places I looked to get my info. Then they are going to post their works cited in a Canvas course or other accessible environment. I want it to be online and not on paper because I want other students to be able to get to it easily. So if some other student is at home in the evening working on their project, they can click somewhere and get to this resource. The non-honors classes could also put on a wax museum. So both classes are still gonna do the wax museum, but instead of laboring through the research and the synthesis and the script writing, they could now devote their cognitive energy to the synthesis and writing of their script for the wax museum. So basically what we've done is we've challenged those honor students to create a product that other folks can use. They're going to put it somewhere where it's accessible, and we've allowed the non-honor students to focus all of their energy on the delivery. So along with this, I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to be teaching them to do a works cited page, I'm probably going to have to emphasize some citations. I'll make sure they all use proper citations on their works cited page. So what I'm going to do is just teach them how to use a citation generator. So if I were to write this out in one of those lesson plan templates, I would have a primary objective that involves these things, and I would have a secondary objective involving the citations. So what that might look like is something like this. This is a template that you have in your participant folder. You're going to see that it's basically just I kind of call it an objective generator. It breaks the parts of an objective down into 3 main sections, and we're going to put this to use in just a moment with the example that I just did. But first, let's take a look at this template so we know what we're working with. The first thing I need to think about is what thinking do the students have to do? Think of blooms, okay? Are they going to identify things, define things, generate things, evaluate things? What will they know or do? So whatever it is we're trying to get across to them, that goes here. And that should come from the standards. That's what we've been talking about in using these objectives to make sure that we are reaching the standards. And then the last part of it is what product will they create to show their learning? And this is going to be an activity or it could be an assessment. So I can't type on this and still keep it nice and large for you guys. So I want you to imagine that the following text is going into these boxes. So let's go back and review for a second. Okay, the honor students, they're going to be working on a works cited page, and then they're going to post that works cited page. And all of this, of course, is so that they can eventually participate in the Wax Museum. But my part of this lesson and this section of the lesson is specifically about the works cited. So I'm going to keep that in. One thing to know is that this template is not simply an A plus B plus C equals D. This is just to help you gather your thoughts. You're going to have to kind of smith these words together so that they actually make sense. And you might even find yourself jumping around in these boxes and not going linearly across. That's completely fine. You'll see me do that here. So if I go here to the beginning, if I start over here, what thinking do students have to do? They're going to be generating a citation. They're not creating anything fresh and brand new from scratch. They're simply using the elements of a document. So I'm going to say students will generate in this box. And immediately when I say generate in my head, the next part that wants to fill itself in is generate what. So I'm going to skip out here to this last box. What product will they create to show their learning? Students will generate a works cited page. And then that leaves me here in this center box. What will they do or know? That comes from the standards. And our standard was sharing products with an authentic audience. This is where I'll talk about the works cited page that will be shared on Canvas and accessible to others. So then I'd be ready to put all this together in a sentence that makes sense. So it would probably say, students will generate a works cited page that will be posted on Canvas and accessible to others. That would be my objective. And that's what I would be guiding students to do in my interactions within this lesson. Now, to write my secondary objective, if I want them to be successful in using a citation generator, I would have something separate that said, okay, if it's a citation generator, what thinking will they have to do? Well, I know how citation generators work. Generally, it's just a lot of navigating back and forth from the document to the generator and pulling across those elements. So I would probably say navigate here. And the product that they would create, so they're going to navigate around what? So I would say it's a citation generator in this instance. And this does not come from my standards. There's nothing in there about citation generators. There is something in there about engage, about ethically using and reproducing others' work. But if I'm not really hitting that standard head on, if I am really just introducing this as a byproduct of the requirements of the assignment, I'm probably going to just be looking for a successful completion of the citation. So mine would probably say students will navigate a citation generator, and so I would just put that out here. So why did we go to the trouble of generating those objectives? Was it just to fulfill something on the team rubric? Or was it to have something to post on my wall for walkthroughs by administrators? No. We went through the objective creation so that we have a very clear idea of the purpose and intention of this lesson. If I know and students know that my objective is for them to create a works cited page that will be posted on Canvas and will be accessible to others, then I can look at their work or their progress toward their work and say, yes, this student is on track, or ooh, I see some confusion here. I need to work with this student one-on-one. Students can look at my objective and say, oh, this is the expectation of me. These are the things I must do. I'll know that I'm successful when I'm able to do the things in that objective. So that objective gives us a clear goal to aim for as we're teaching our lesson. Now you may be thinking, what about the other parts of this activity that you mentioned? How the CP, the college prep kids, were going to take this works cited and do their research so that they can be ready for the Wax Museum too, but without all the labor of actually, sifting through all the sources. That will happen later, and in my mind, that will happen probably in a couple of subsequent lessons. The objective you write should be something that is resolved by the end of the learning exposure. So sometimes that might be one class period. For this particular scenario, I'm envisioning one class period. However, if you have very short windows of time where you're able to work with teachers, yours might be 2 or possibly even 3. Later on, when we tackle getting those college prep kids to access this works cited page and then go in and use those sources to start taking their notes, I would have a completely different objective. For those scenarios, I might have something like this. Students in college prep, social studies will access the works cited pages posted by their peers on Canvas and extract 8 to 10 facts about a particular emperor. So my objectives are going to be different, and they're going to continue to lead students down the path to the actual, full completion of this teacher's assignment, and they're going to take that step by step by step. Okay, if you are not very comfortable with writing clear objectives yet, and I know that a lot of people are in that boat, it can be a little daunting if it's not something that you've had in your toolbox for a long, long time. I'd like for you guys to spend some time right now practicing writing your objective. So let's go back to that OPAC lesson that you elevated just a few minutes ago. And I want you to create an objective for that lesson. What is it that students need to be able to do by the end of the lesson? You will not include every facet of your lesson in the objective because there will be things that you introduce, things that you explain, maybe even things that you have students practicing leading up to that big final goal, which is your objective. That's what you need to craft. So as you're going through that OPAC lesson, what thinking the students have to do? Are they creating? Are they describing? Are they comparing? And if you're not really sure what label to put on that, you can Google a Bloom's taxonomy chart and you'll find lots and lots of options there. Choose the one that best fits what you have in mind for this lesson. Think about the standard that you have selected in your elevation for that lesson. What are students going to be able to walk away with according to the standard? and think about the product that they'll create. And remember, that can be something that comes from an activity they do, or that can be a formal or informal assessment. If For instance, if you wanted to see that students were successful in crafting a keyword search and then using the OPAC results to find a book on the shelf, now, I wouldn't do that because that's not in our standards. However, we'll use that example. The assessment could be you just observing and checking off on a clipboard who was successful and who wasn't. So it doesn't have to be a big, a summative exam as far as assessment goes, but there needs to be some monitoring so that you can know who's got it and who still needs help. So I want you to pause and craft that objective. If you think that, hey, maybe this lesson could go a couple of different directions, imagine what other elevation you could apply to your OPAC lesson and create a second objective for that. Practice is what's going to get you into a good, comfortable routine with writing these. So pause and then come back to the video when you're ready. So this chart was used during the 2-day training, and that's why it says today and tomorrow on it. But the tasks are the same as what we've set out to accomplish today. So we've talked about the work done by the committee. We've talked about common beliefs. We have used the standards framework and hopefully helped you gain some familiarity with all the standards. We've talked about choosing one shared foundation that you're very comfortable with to focus on this year alongside another shared foundation that is probably not your most comfortable, so that you can grow in that area this year. Curate library and created objectives. We have not talked about that yet. That's coming up in just a moment. Elevate current lessons. We've talked about that. We just finished up writing strong objectives using Bloom's. So we are going to talk about curating objectives next. After looking at the learner framework for quite a bit today, you've probably begun to gravitate towards a couple of these that are feeling really comfortable for you. Perhaps you're thinking, oh, these are things I do frequently anyway. These are things that I'm passionate about. And maybe you found yourself kind of shying away from a few that look, ooh, these are new. These are things that are not in my wheelhouse currently. So what we're going to do to try to bridge that knowledge gap so that we have a good understanding of all the shared foundations eventually is you are going to be choosing something that we're calling a major. That means you're going to choose a shared foundation that you are already feeling really good about. Then you're going to think about that shared foundation that's maybe not super comfortable for you. That's going to be your minor. And what you're going to do with this major and minor is, when you engage with elevating lessons, you are going to look in your major and say, hey, is there anything that I'm already a rock star at that I could apply to this lesson? That's going to simplify things for you a bit. You can also look at that minor and say, ooh, is there anything in this one that I could really challenge myself with? Is there a way I can pull in something from that minor shared foundation as I elevate a lesson that'll cause me and my students to grow in a place where maybe we haven't spent a lot of time before? You're going to mark your selections on Form 6.1 in your participant folder. The reason I'm having you mark them here is not because I'm going to police who's doing what. I'm not concerned about that, but it is going to provide us with a valuable piece of information so that when we are planning PDs in the future, let's say, for instance, if we were going to do some PD around Inquire, I can look on this form and say, oh, these 7 people are already rock stars with Inquire. Maybe I could consult with them to get some ideas or some expertise in this area. So This is not any kind of formal commitment. This is just something that I'd like for you to record so that we can network and reach out to people in the future. So the next thing for you to do is to set a goal for how often you're going to elevate the current lessons that you have on hand. Some of you have a bank of lesson plans that you use from year to year. Some of you who are newer maybe don't have that. Whatever your scenario is, think about what's reasonable for you on how frequently you'll do this. You don't have to do every single lesson, but you do need to choose a pattern or choose some kind of commitment that's going to challenge you but not overwhelm you. So here's some suggestions that I've seen some folks commit to. One of these might ring true for you, or something else might be a better fit for you. Maybe you want to elevate one lesson per week, or maybe if you're on a fixed schedule, you might say something like, I'm going to elevate every fourth grade lesson. Maybe it's something that you teach regularly, even though you're not on a fixed schedule. So some folks have said, I'm going to do all of my orientation lessons, both fall semester and spring semester. Some folks have said, for instance, anytime I work with my ELA teachers, I'm going to elevate those lessons. Whatever works for you is fine. You're going to make a commitment to yourself on file 11. You can print that out and hang it somewhere where it's in your line of sight so that you're reminded pretty regularly. You can save it on your computer. Whatever works for you is fine with me. I don't need this sheet. This is not, any kind of assignment that I'm giving you. I'm not going to track who's doing what. This is simply a commitment to yourself. So far, you're going to choose the two shared foundations to focus on, a major and a minor. And then you're going to craft a goal that holds you accountable to how frequently you think you can engage in this work. And the final tool that we're going to talk about is finally getting around to curating these objectives. If you open file 10 in your participant folder, you're going to see a document that has 3 links on it. The links are for an elementary spreadsheet, a middle school spreadsheet, and a high school spreadsheet. And these are going to become objective banks. So you're going to open up the one that matches the grade band that you teach in, and you're going to see, actually, I'm going to open that up now. You're going to see that the learner framework has been turned into a spreadsheet. And there are also some other tools that I've built in here. I'm going to tour those for you so you'll get an idea of what's happening. So here you have the learner framework, same information that's available through AASL. Down at the bottom, you're going to see some different tabs. This first page is the entire learner framework. Then the framework is broken down into the 6 shared foundations. There's a sheet for inquire, include, collaborate, and so on and so forth. If you continue on down those sheets at the bottom, you're going to see some other helpful planning links. If you open content area standards, you're going to find some direct links to, for instance, here's ELA, social studies, science. That way you don't have to click all over school wires and Canvas to try to find other subject areas curricula. If you are collaborating with someone, or if you're trying to coordinate your instruction to coincide with a particular unit of study, you can get your hands on those here. We also have the ISTE standards. Now remember, these aren't the main standards of your instruction. Those are the AASL standards, but I know some of you have a really heavy technology role, and so if you wanted to plan some lessons that do some double duty as far as addressing AASL standards and ISTE standards, you could find those here. So let's go back to a shared foundation. I'm going to click Collaborate. These are the different domains across the top. We've got some think, create, share, and grow, just like we do on the framework. Then down the side, you have grade bands, grade levels. So there's 6th grade, and then 7th and 8th are on down through here. What you'll do when you write an objective that goes with one of your shared foundations, your major or your minor, I'd like for you to record that objective in the objective bank. So for instance, if I write an objective for a 6th grade lesson that is aimed at think number 2, I'm going to record that objective here. I'd also like for you to put your name on it. The reason we're doing that is because when we start getting this filled in with different objectives that are going on all across the county, we're going to use this document to see if there are patterns, if there are some holes. We're going to use this to see what do we need to continue to work on. You guys, as practitioners, can use this to get some places to start your lesson planning. We are not curating lesson plans because past experience has shown that that's not always super effective. Often when one person shares a lesson plan with another, we have high hopes for it, but when we get in and start reading it, we realize, oh, there's some things here that just don't fit. For instance, maybe I only have students for 30 minutes and this lesson plan was designed for a 55-minute block. Or, oh, I don't have 30 iPads and this lesson was designed for a class full of iPad use. So there's frequently something that causes the lesson plan to be a bad fit. So we've decided to curate the objectives because you can look at an objective and then begin, that's a good place to kind of grab some brainstorming, get a head start there, and then decide what will work for your specific students in your specific scenario. We'd like for you to put your name on there in case another librarian sees your objective and says, ooh, I'd like to know more about that. They'll know who they can reach out to. Well, let's see if any objectives have already been added here. I don't see any for collaborate. That's okay. That just means that no one's gotten around to that one yet. Let's see if there, oh, look here. Here we have in Explore, we've already got some entries here. So I see some more over here. These are great places where you can look and say, hey, my students need that too. So I hope that you'll use this as a planning tool. Okay. Back to our presentation. So you just got a little tour of the objective bank. Here are some FAQs that kind of popped up during the summer. Do I enter every objective I teach throughout the year? No, just the ones that come from the lessons you elevated with your 2 shared foundations. So if I back up a step, you should have an objective, at least 1 or maybe 2, that you created today through listening to this presentation that you could go ahead and contribute to the objective bank. The next question is, what if I'm not crazy about an objective I aimed for in a lesson? It happens to all of us. You plan something and it doesn't go quite as you'd expect it to. That's okay. Enter it anyway. It may provide someone else with an idea or at least a partial idea. What if my objective is similar to someone else's? What if I look at the objective bank and I say, oh, hey, I did something like that too? Go ahead and enter your objective anyway. Seeing duplicates will let us know where patterns are and what's being emphasized across the county. And so that brings us to our wrap up. Your charge for this year, now that you've gained some knowledge in our standards rollout, is to, number one, stay involved in conversations and professional development. The Library Media Services Department will be restructuring the monthly PD opportunities so that there will be lots of conversations and opportunities based around these standards. Attend, join. The next thing is to simply spend time with those common beliefs and the learner framework. Have them somewhere accessible so that you can look at them frequently. Dig deep into your two shared foundations. You've chosen these two, your major and your minor, for a reason. Spend some time really picking those apart. Look at the objective banks where other people are working through the same shared foundations that you are. Study their work. What can you learn from them and what can you share with them? And sharing is going to come through contributing to the objective bank. The objective bank will only work if you guys contribute to it. So please set aside some time, maybe establish a routine that maybe looks something like this. Every Thursday afternoon, I'm going to take 3 minutes to add my objectives to the objective bank. This is going to serve as a really helpful tool, but only if we build it ourselves. Meet or exceed the goal you set for your the number of elevations you want to attempt this year. That's going to give you that practice that builds those muscles. And practice writing objectives. When we went through that objective writing template, if there were some things there that felt a little foreign to you, practice, practice, practice. This is a skill like any other, and the more you practice it, the more comfortable and more capable you'll become. If you need to go back and revisit some things, over in the Canvas course named the Business Center, that's the one you probably get in and out of frequently for newsletters, you're going to find a module called Teaching the Standards. There's lots of supporting documents and refresher guides in there in case you need that. That same information is posted in the Instruction and Management course. If that's a course that you get into and out of frequently, we wanted to put it in 2 places so that you could get to it as easily as possible. Thank you for attending. Again, this recording is available to anyone at any time, so if you ever need to go back and thank you for attending. I hope that you got some direction that's going to be really useful for you this year. If you have questions or if you need support, please don't hesitate to reach out to Amber. Also, again, stay involved. There are going to be plenty of opportunities to grow in our standards instruction, both this year and in the 2 upcoming years as part of our 3-year rollout. And we hope to see you enjoying these standards and helping our students become college and career ready. After looking at the learner framework quite a bit today, I'd like for you, after looking at the learner framework for quite a bit today, you've probably begun to gravitate towards a couple of these that are feeling really comfortable for you. Perhaps you're thinking, oh, these are things I do frequently anyway. These are things that I'm passionate about. And maybe you found yourself kind of shying away from a few that look, ooh, these are new. These are things that are not in my wheelhouse currently. So what we're going to do to try to bridge that knowledge gap so that we have a good understanding of all the shared foundations eventually is you are going to be choosing something that we're calling a major. That means you're going to choose a shared foundation that you are already feeling really good about. Then you're going to think about that shared foundation that's maybe not super comfortable for you. That's going to be your minor. And what you're going to do with this major and minor is when you engage with elevating lessons, you are going to look in your major and say, hey, is there anything that I'm already a rock star at that I could apply to this lesson? That's going to simplify things for you a bit. You can also look at that minor and say, ooh, is there anything in this one that I could really challenge myself with? Is there a way I can pull in something from that minor shared foundation as I elevate a lesson that'll cause me and my students to grow in a place where maybe we haven't spent a lot of time before? You're going to mark your selections on Form 6.1 in your participant folder. The reason I'm having you mark them here is not because I'm going to police who's doing what. I'm not concerned about that, but it is going to provide us with a valuable piece of information so that when we are planning PDs in the future, let's say for instance, if we were going to do some PD around Inquire, I can look on this form and say, oh, these 7 people are already rock stars with Inquire. Maybe I could consult with them to get some ideas or some expertise in this area. So this is not any kind of formal commitment. This is just something that I'd like for you to record so that we can network and reach out to people in the future.